October 16, 1942, 0500 hours. Northern District, Stalingrad. The sky was black with ash, and the wind smelled like rusted iron and scorched canvas. Overhead, tracer rounds carved fading lines through the smoke. The Volga River hissed under the cold, its eastern banks now a blur of floating corpses and half-submerged supply barges. The Red October factory stood in silence, its skeletal framework a jagged silhouette against the pulsing horizon. Somewhere deep inside the twisted iron and fractured concrete, a man was tightening a copper wire around a rifle. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from precision. Private Timofey Antonovich Reznikov, age 31, former apprentice machinist from Novosibirsk, squinted through the narrow slit of a broken observation post. His uniform was stiff with dried mud. His breath fogged the glass shard he had mounted to the rear bridge of his Mosin Nagant. The device, if it could be called that, looked more like an accident than an invention. But it worked. It had worked for 39 confirmed engagements. They called it Glaz Sumashedshego, the madman's eye. Not officially. No such term existed in the reports. The political officers dismissed it. The engineers refused to acknowledge it. The quartermasters called it dangerously unofficial. But to the men who carried rifles, to those who cleared hallways and cellars with bullets measured in seconds, the eye was something else entirely. It had no magnification. It did not enhance light, nor zoom. What it did, quietly, brilliantly, was center itself, using a pivot system of wires and balance weights scavenged from aircraft instruments, clock springs, and bicycle brake cables. It floated, or more precisely, it hovered, always returning to alignment with the horizon, compensating for tilt, recoil, stress, and poor posture. Where the soldier's shoulder sagged under exhaustion, the eye corrected. Where the cheek weld faltered, the lens forgave. Timofey had begun building it months before the front reached the Volga. At first it was a mental sketch, a correction mechanism he'd imagined while repairing gyroscopic sighting tools for bomber crews in a rail yard outside Omsk. He had seen what vibration did to aim. He had seen gunners miss entire columns by fractions of a degree at the wrong moment, not because they were careless, but because in war, the body betrayed the intent. He wanted to solve that. He wasn't a physicist. He wasn't a sniper. He was simply a man who understood that the problem wasn't seeing. It was aligning under pressure. He fashioned the first lens from the corner glass of a German cockpit window, peeled off a wreck near Tula. It was optically flawed, but Timofey didn't care. He didn't need perfection. He needed a surface that could reflect intent. He mounted it on a cradle formed from gas mask straps and piano wire, weighted with slivers of lead carved from an artillery fuse. The suspension was gimbaled, free to pivot but always returning to a neutral axis defined by gravity, counterweight, and recoil balance. The reticle? A burn mark, the melted thread of a Soviet infantry scarf, etched onto a pane with a focused beam of sunlight through a magnifier lens. The thread crisped at the center. That was the aiming point. By the time he reached Stalingrad, the third version was mounted to his personal Mosin Nagant. He had not asked permission. He had not spoken of it to his sergeant. He only cleaned it at night, inside his sleeve, away from the barracks light. The first man he shot with the eye was climbing through a collapsed window with a submachine gun. 20 meters, center mass, one shot, no breath, no pause, no recoil correction. The lens did the correction. The second shot was from a rooftop down into a courtyard. 50 meters, moving target. One round. The glass swung gently as he tilted the rifle, then settled, and he fired. That was when his platoon started watching. By the end of the second week, Timofey had fired 52 rounds, 41 hits, 39 confirmed kills. Not by volume, not by machine gun madness, by calm, by balance, by a device made in silence that realigned the heart of the weapon to the instinct of the man. It spread slowly, not officially, not by command, but by whispers. A wounded scout asked if Timofey could build another, then a sniper, then a demolition sergeant. But Timofey said no. Not because he was selfish, but because he couldn't replicate it under pressure. Each lens took hours to tune. Each tension wire had to respond to a specific barrel harmonics. He didn't use charts. He used feel. He used breath. He used memory. He built 4 more during his time in the city. 2 survived more than 2 weeks. 1 made it to the river and back. The other was found shattered beside its owner's body. The lens fused with blood and dust. The rest of the army didn't care. They had tanks to move, bridges to build, cities to lose. But inside the ruins, among the shock troops and riflemen tasked with clearing buildings brick by brick, the madman's eye became myth. No one knew how it worked. No one cared. They just knew it let a man shoot without thinking, not by automation, but by agreement. Rifle and mind became one. In late November, a political officer arrived from the 62nd Army's Morale Division. He asked Timofey if he would demonstrate the optical device for potential doctrinal adoption. Timofey declined. "It's not doctrine," he said, "it's rhythm." The officer frowned. He was transferred the next day, not punished, not promoted, simply moved, quietly. No record of the device was taken, no design was copied. He ended up in the ruins of a metallurgical plant on the southern bank. There, in a basement that had once stored lubricants for the furnace pistons, Timofey set up a workbench made from 2 collapsed crates and a truck door. He scavenged wire. He ground glass. He repurposed compass rings, artillery spring guides, wristwatch pins. He built, slowly, obsessively. He never carried more than 1. Never gave them names. He didn't call them sights. He called them aligners. Not because they changed what was seen, but because they brought the shooter back to center even under duress, even in panic, especially in fear. In December, as the first Soviet counterattacks pushed toward the outskirts, Timofey was wounded by a shell that collapsed a stairwell over his post. His left forearm was fractured. The lens was cracked. The rifle splintered. He carried the remains out in his coat. In a barn 2 kilometers behind the lines, he reset the tension frame with 1 arm, using his teeth to tie the guide wires. 3 days later, he made the last shot of his war, a German forward observer lining up a flare through a chimney. Distance, 76 meters. Conditions, snow, low light. Result, 1 shot, 1 kill. The sight shattered under recoil. He did not rebuild it. He wrapped the broken lens in a strip of oilcloth and buried it in a ration tin beneath a burned-out field kitchen. He never fired again. The war moved on. Timofey moved with it, not as a shooter, but as a technician. He repaired sights. Real ones. PU scopes, SVT optics, field binoculars. He worked in shadows, never speaking of the madman's eye. When asked by an officer why he no longer fought, he said, "I once saw too clearly." He returned to Novosibirsk in 1946. No medals, no pension. He resumed work in a machine shop manufacturing locomotive bushings. He died in 1951. No obituary. No record of the device survives. Only a hand-drawn sketch found decades later in a war diary, showing a rifle with a floating lens and a caption scrawled beneath in pencil. For the ones who didn't have time to aim. The notebook was found in the pocket of a fallen soldier during the Vistula-Oder offensive. Its cover was scorched. Inside were fragmented sketches, fragments of formulas, and the outline of what appeared to be an optical suspension system. There was no name. Just initials. TAR, no unit insignia matched. It would take 2 years before an intelligence officer in the Western Military District noticed a pattern among reports filed by company commanders during the defense of Stalingrad. In a narrow cluster of entries, mostly within a single month, several squads logged unusually high precision under stress from conscripts without formal sniper training. The entries weren't centralized. Some were lost. Others were never intended for review. But between the lines, it became clear that somewhere, in the midst of urban collapse, someone had created a tool that gave ordinary men extraordinary balance. One report mentioned a kind of gyroscopic sight mounted with copper rings, found on a weapon recovered from a fallen comrade. Another described a floating glass lens that centers regardless of body angle. There were too many references to dismiss. And yet there was no directive, no order, no field manual entry. Because what Timofey had built didn't belong to the Red Army. It didn't belong to any army. It belonged to the war. And then it disappeared. Except it hadn't. In the autumn of 1946, just after the reorganization of the Soviet industrial complex, A shipment of obsolete weapons from Western fronts was slated for destruction. Among the crates was a Mosin Nagant rifle with a strange device still mounted to its bridge. The quartermaster at the Smolensk decommissioning yard opened the crate, looked at the sight and laughed. "Crazy man's idea," he said. Probably made him feel better. The rifle was scrapped, but the device, that survived. The quartermaster had a son who liked to tinker. He unscrewed the sight and took it home, mounted it on the wall. A curiosity, a relic. It stayed there until the boy, now grown, brought it to his instructor at the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology in 1953. "What do you make of this?" he asked. The professor turned it over, tapped it, ran a flashlight behind the glass. Suspended inside the frame, the lens hovered gently in place, never quite fixed, never quite loose. He raised an eyebrow. "Not a scope," he murmured. "Some kind of passive balancer?" The device was taken apart, measured, sketched. The inner workings were deceptively simple. The suspension was triaxial, 2 lateral pivots and a vertical guideline, like a free-floating gimbal. The wires were tensioned through a melted resin bead, which functioned like a crude damper. There were no optics in the traditional sense, no magnification, no field correction, no coatings. Just a lens that stayed level when the shooter didn't. The professor's conclusion was recorded in a memo. Unreliable for standardized mass use, fragile, non-serviceable under field conditions. However, the mechanism is inspired. It compensates for poor form, allows non-expert operators to stabilize quickly under stress, ideal for spontaneous engagement at short to medium range in urban combat. The report was shelved, but the instructor, a veteran of Stalingrad himself, kept the pieces in his desk drawer until the day he died. No one would ever replicate the madman's eye, because no one ever truly understood how it was tuned, not by measurement, but by feel. Ammunition was never perfect. Rifles weren't either. Iron sights assumed symmetry in bodies and minds that rarely had it. What Timofey built acknowledged that war wasn't fair, wasn't clean, and didn't wait. It answered with a device that helped you find alignment, even while everything else collapsed around you. It didn't teach you to shoot. It helped you survive long enough to remember how. His story, for decades, lived only in whispers, among the few veterans who had seen him work, among the dying letters in attic boxes, and among footnotes no historian ever followed. But in one letter, dated February 1947, written by a sergeant named Malikov to his cousin in Kursk, there was this line: "I saw a man fire a rifle with a lens like a floating glass eye. He shot 2 men with 2 bullets while his leg bled out through his boot. He didn't miss, not once, not in 6 months. I don't know what he built, but I know this. We wouldn't have taken those buildings without it." The cousin never replied. The war ended. People moved on, but the balance didn't. Somewhere in the laws of motion, in the invisible war between the trigger and the breath, between the shoulder and the barrel, that small device, hand-wired, field-borne, made by a machinist who just wanted to steady his hands, rewrote the equation of a kill shot, not through domination, not through doctrine, through equilibrium. March 1943, outskirts of Kharkov. The spring melt had begun, but the corpses didn't thaw. Frozen German uniforms lay half-submerged in pools of snowmelt, rifles still clutched in hands too rigid to release them. The Red Army was advancing again, block by block, hedge by hedge. Among them, a small reconnaissance unit of the 40th Army made its way through a ravaged warehouse district, tasked with scouting German fallback positions. Among them was a young corporal named Mikhail Krestov, fresh, quiet, and forgettable, save for the strange device mounted on his rifle. He never explained where he got it. When asked, he simply said, "Pass down." To most, it looked like junk, an old lens in a brass frame, loosely wired into a Mosin's rear bridge like a field repair gone wrong. But when Mikhail raised the rifle and fired, the bullet always seemed to land exactly where it needed to. The older soldiers noticed. So did the Germans. During a patrol near the Kharkov freight yards, Mikhail's team was ambushed by a Wehrmacht machine gun nest hidden beneath the collapsed shell of a boxcar. The first volley dropped 2 of his comrades. The third crouched behind a pile of bricks, wounded, screaming. Mikhail moved without a word. He rose, leveled his rifle just above the lowest brick line, waited for the telltale glint of the MG-34's muzzle, and fired. One round. The gun went silent. He dragged the wounded man back and never said a word. Later that night, a senior lieutenant asked to inspect his rifle. Mikhail handed it over without hesitation. The man turned it in his hands, tapped the lens and muttered, "Primitive." He aimed it once, scoffed and returned it. But he never questioned Mikhail's place in the next patrol. From then on, the stories resurfaced. "Reznikov's eye," they whispered, "built in the basement of Stalingrad." It wasn't true. Not exactly. But legends grow where gaps exist, and the war was full of gaps. The truth was simpler. The idea hadn't died with Timofey Reznikov. He had passed it on, not in blueprints, not in engineering notes, but in the rifle itself. Mikhail had been a signal runner in Stalingrad, barely 17, when he found the body of a lone soldier under a collapsed stairwell. The man's face was caked in soot and blood. His rifle, miraculously, was undamaged. He took it. He didn't even realize what was mounted to it until weeks later, and when he did, he couldn't explain it. But when he looked through the floating lens, a strange calm settled in his chest, like his body, for the first time, wasn't working against him. He kept it. He tuned it. He learned its rhythm. And now, on the path to liberate Kharkov, he carried forward what Reznikov had started. The kills mounted. Each time, the same pattern: short range, low angle, urban. No time to aim. No margin for error. But Mikhail didn't miss. He wasn't a hero. He never asked to lead. But the others began to follow him in firefights, unconsciously, instinctively, as if something about the way he moved, the way he fired, reassured them. They called him the lens bearer. In April, the site cracked under debris after a German artillery round collapsed part of a building. Mikhail tried to fix it, but couldn't. The inner ring was warped. The tension lines snapped. He buried the rifle beneath a fig tree behind the station depot and requisitioned a standard-issue weapon. His aim was never the same. 3 months later, he was wounded in the ribs during a skirmish in Belgorod. He survived, but he never returned to the front. The site was never seen again, but its influence echoed in the smallest places. Autumn 1944, Warsaw Uprising. A Soviet liaison unit operating with Polish partisans discovered an old Mosin fitted with a strange optic. The soldier who carried it, a former watchmaker named Alexander Gorsky, claimed he had been given the weapon by a dying Russian months prior in the forests outside Lublin. Gorsky had mounted the lens to a shortened carbine and used it to ambush German troops entering courtyards. His kills: 17 in 12 days, no misses. A German officer's posthumous report, later recovered from captured archives, noted, "A shooter operating at low angles, striking from unstable positions, likely with some form of stabilizing sight." Of course, German intelligence dismissed the claim. Too primitive to matter. They were wrong. The lens, the idea, it moved like water through the cracks of war, passed from soldier to soldier, never formalized, never taught, but deeply understood by those who needed it most, because it was never a sniper tool. It wasn't about glory or even accuracy in the traditional sense. It was about that moment between seeing and acting, when the mind hesitates and the hand shakes, and offering just enough forgiveness to let the shot happen anyway. Some claimed it was psychological, others called it superstition, but those who had used it said only one thing: it knew where center was, even when I didn't. January 1945, Eastern Prussia. Snow as deep as a man's knees, and the cold so sharp it cracked rifle stocks. The Soviet push westward had turned relentless, but with it came attrition of another kind. Replacements were rushed to the front with less training. Weapons arrived out of alignment. Ammunition was mixed lot, inconsistent. And yet, among a reconnaissance unit of the 5th Guards Army, a pattern emerged again. Engagements at close range won not by weight of fire, but by uncanny precision under pressure. The commander, Captain Yuri Demichev, was a career officer. Strict, intelligent, skeptical of myths, but even he began to notice that certain kills seemed to defy the conditions. A young Kazakh conscript named Temirbek was credited with eliminating 4 German soldiers inside a collapsed chapel, each at a different angle, each shot through narrow windows or broken columns, each with a single bullet. Demichev called him in. "How long you been shooting like that?" Temirbek shrugged. "Since Warsaw." Demichev examined the rifle. There it was again, the lens, mounted in a copper-twined gimbal housing, fixed with melted resin and a loop of cloth for shock absorption. Crude, non-standard, but unmistakable. "Who built this?" The boy looked away. "I don't know his name, only that he gave it to me when I was freezing and told me to trust it more than myself." Demichev kept the rifle overnight. He tried to use it, fired 10 test rounds, hit 6 targets. Not bad, but not magical. When he returned it, he didn't scold Temirbek. He didn't report him. He simply said, "Use it until it tells you to stop." Later that spring, outside the ruins of Kustrin, Demichev was nearly killed, clearing a stairwell. Temirbek, 15 meters behind, fired once through a doorway at a moving shadow. The bullet missed Demichev's shoulder by a finger's width and struck the enemy in the face. Demichev never questioned the lens again. There is a concept in warfare, rarely spoken but deeply felt, of invisible technology. Not invisible in the literal sense, but invisible to the bureaucracy. Tools that slip between definitions, devices that aren't mass-produced or mass-understood, but are passed hand to hand as trusted as a shovel or a flask. Reznikov's lens, in all its iterations, was one such tool. It never made it into Soviet doctrine. It was never standardized, but it lived. In early May 1945, as Berlin collapsed under artillery and fire, one of the last recorded uses of the device took place in a metro tunnel beneath Alexanderplatz. The Red Army was clearing bunkers, and visibility was reduced to torchlight and echoes. A soldier named Ilya Borodin, operating alone after his squad was separated, encountered 2 German officers and a machine gunner retreating into a maintenance chamber. He fired 3 times, 3 dead. When his squad found him, they thought he had been rescued by support fire. He hadn't. On his rifle they found the lens, scorched and cracked but intact. Ilya later told a war correspondent, "I didn't aim, I just looked. It told me when." He was 20 years old. He died in a car crash in 1953. The rifle was buried with him. No one recovered the lens. There are no monuments to Reznikov, no diagrams in training manuals, no military museums carry his name. But when American intelligence agents studied Soviet wartime small arms performance in the early 1960s, they came across a handful of after-action reports detailing improvised reflex devices used in Stalingrad and beyond. One report, unclassified decades later, included a diagram of a lens in suspension. In the margin, a handwritten note: "This is not optical enhancement, it's psychological stabilization, possibly spiritual." No follow-up was made. The Cold War had no patience for ghosts. But those who had used it, the handful still alive in the 1970s, the 80s, would still fall quiet when asked about it. At reunions, old men with scarred hands and fading tattoos would speak of a lens that settled your breath and hovered like a thing alive. They said it wasn't just for aim, it was for doubt. When your heart was beating like a drum and your mind racing ahead of your fingers, the lens would float, return to center, and wait for you to come back to yourself. And if you listened, if you fired then, not before, not after, the bullet would land. That was the miracle. Not that it made you perfect, but that it let you survive your own panic. And for some men that was more valuable than any medal. In 1989, after the Iron Curtain began to lift and Soviet archives began to thaw under political reform, a small collection of personal wartime diaries was declassified by the Ministry of Defense for academic review. Among them was a notebook attributed to an unidentified armorer stationed near Kalak in 1942. The entries were terse, technical, obsessed with balance, tension, and a concept he referred to as neutral gravity optics. One diagram stood out, a crude sketch of a rifle, a Mosin Nagant, with a suspended lens in a wire cradle. No annotations, no signature. But it matched survivor sketches almost exactly. A researcher, a Belarusian historian studying Soviet battlefield engineering improvisations, attempted to trace the source. There was no inventory of such devices, no production contracts, no blueprints. All she found were fragments, letters, descriptions, a few photos of rifles with unknown attachments blacked out by sensors. She gave up the search. But in her final paper she wrote, "There existed between the cracks of Red Army doctrine a device of fragile ingenuity, not designed for mass use, but for the desperation of individual clarity. It is the only sight in the war's history built not to enhance range or magnification, but to restore presence to the shooter. It did not change the battlefield, it changed the heartbeat." Her paper was rejected. But a decade later, a retired Soviet sniper named Vasily Cherepenko, interviewed for a regional television program, was asked if he had ever seen a strange sighting device during the war. He nodded once. Once, in Stalingrad, a man had something wired to his rifle. Looked like a broken compass. I laughed at it. 2 days later I watched him shoot a German through the fog, 70 meters. Could barely see with my own eyes. But he saw. What happened to him? The interviewer asked. Cherepenko paused. He died that night, shrapnel, but the rifle stayed warm in my hands for 3 more months. Did you use the device? No. Why not? Because it wasn't mine. It wouldn't have worked. Why? The old man looked into the distance. Because it was part of him, not the rifle. May 9th, 1995, Victory Day, Moscow. An exhibition of rare weapons was held at the Central Museum of the Armed Forces. In a glass case, amid piles of rusted bayonets and deactivated pistols, a rifle was displayed, with an unusual sight mounted to it. A brass and glass device suspended on frayed wire. The placard read, "Unidentified battlefield modification, believed to be field-crafted in 1942, function unknown." A child pointed at it and asked his grandfather what it was. The man leaned closer. His face changed. He whispered, "That's the madman's eye." And for a moment, in that crowded museum hall, a war no one understood anymore came briefly into focus, not as strategy, not as ideology, but as the memory of one man's attempt to control chaos with a lens the size of a coin. Because sometimes, the greatest invention of war isn't the one that kills faster or farther or louder. Sometimes it's the one that lets you breathe. And for a few men, in the worst winter of the worst war, that was enough.